We're actually a panel about patients partnering in drug development, but it said something about disruptive innovation, which I'm sure we can also do. And the idea of this session about patients partnering in the drug development process was to give you an idea, since most people in this room comes from the patient community, of how, no matter how small your disease is or how large, or how early you are, like there's nothing known about it, or it's already a very advanced field, there's always a lot of things you can do. Because the topic is partnering, we have today in this session, we're 3 scientists that work within the patient community and 3 mothers of people with rare diseases. So we already illustrate a bit that partnering. We're doing this together. And the idea is that you will see some examples of that partnering, big and small, and hear about the challenges and their successes, because we've asked them to cover both sides, and mainly have this collection of experiences, so you don't find yourself in this room saying, well, sure, they can do that. It's always the person speaking on TV, but we can't, because we're too small, because we're too rare, because our disease, for some reasons. So I'll start by offering you an introduction to the drug development process, because before we start talking about what we can partner, we need to understand what it is. And, oh, I forgot. Hi, my name is Ana. Didn't introduce myself. And yes, this accent is Spanish. And I'm a scientist, but I spend most of my time in the patient community, so when I say we, it's always the patient community. So drug development is the thing that happens between someone has a disease, a therapy gets developed, and then they can have a therapy. It's that space in between. And if I were to go out to the street and ask the same person, the first person that I come across, who develops therapies, they will probably tell me professors do at universities, probably here in Cambridge, or industry does it, pharma companies. They might also think clinicians might be involved in doing that. But the thing you will probably not hear is patients do get involved into this. But you're here in this room because you know better. So let's start by, first, yes, we are involved in that, but why we should, and then I'll tell you a bit about the stages of that process. But first is, why are we even talking about this if we have all of the scientists and the pharma companies and the clinicians that should be taking care of that? Well, because see where we are. If you have a rare disease and there is a therapy approved, you are rare. 95% have no therapy. And it's not about disease-modifying therapies, it's therapy at all. Only 5% have any therapy approved at all. So by default, many rare diseases will never have a therapy. And that's because it takes so long and it's so expensive to develop a drug that when your population is small, it's just not feasible. It's not feasible, at least following the traditional path. And on top of that, we're just so many. So each one is a rare disease, but there are at least 7,000, sometimes you hear 8,000. And if you're here, it's because there's one that affects you. Either you have it, or your family with someone that has it, maybe you're a scientist, you work on 2 or 3, but that's 2 or 3 of 7,000. And at the rate of orphan drug approval, those are the drugs that treat rare diseases, which is 10 to 15 a year, can you imagine how long before we get to all those 7,000? Well, it's just way too long, which is why I like to call the patient groups the impatient patients. Because the whole idea is like, no way, things are just going too slow, we're too many. So that's why in the rare disease community, patient groups are so central to the whole process, because we can design that roadmap of what needs to be done and set the pace so it's faster. That's why the impatient patient spirit. And if you ask anybody when there's been a drug that reaches the market, ask the regulators and the companies who make this possible, it's always a very strong patient community behind it. That's why we need them. So let me tell you now a little bit about what is that thing, the drug development process that we're trying to make more efficient. And a disclaimer, it's not as easy as in my sim. It's not you start with an idea, you do 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, and there you get your drug. Like everything in life, it's a lot more messy. So you start with an idea, you might or might not end up with a drug, but what's clear is that along the way you're gonna have a lot of wrong corner, turn again, sometimes good luck, because a lot of times it's not the idea that started, but hey, this worked, and eventually you might have a therapy. So I'll show you a little bit about the lineal path, the one that costs 10 years, a lot of money, and a little bit about the exceptions. So I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but for the uninitiated, the way we develop therapies, the straight line, you start by knowing something about the disease, maybe the gene that is causing the disease, and that's basic science. So you decide to develop or discover a molecule that can do what you need to that gene, and that will be discovery. So you have that drug, and now you need to test it in an animal model that has that human disease and ask 2 questions. Does this help and does this hurt? And if it helps and doesn't hurt too much, then you can go from preclinical to clinical and try it in clinical trials where you're going to ask the same 2 questions. Does this help and does this hurt? And if it still helps and doesn't hurt too much, then the regulators will review that, make sure that's okay, and approve it. So this is the straight line. But again, there are a lot of exceptions, and the rare disease field is where most of the exceptions are. Often you will find that if your disease is very similar to another rare disease, you can go straight to clinical trials and things in that rare disease, in that broader umbrella, and you don't have to spend 10 years and a lot of money specifically on yours. Sometimes you can take shortcuts, and we'll hear later about drug repurposing, when you don't have to start discovering a new molecule, but you can use some that was already either very advanced in trials or approved, and so you take a shortcut and start at any of these stages. Or sometimes your disease is so rare, you're not even going to aspire to have drugs marketed. You're just looking for better informed off-label use, like some clinical trials, to know what you're doing. So many exceptions, and also many players, because across this timeline, you're going to find many of those people that we usually think that are developing drugs. Those are going to be the academics. They do mainly the first part. You're going to have the pharmaceutical companies. They come usually once you have to discover that molecule. Clinicians help a lot understand the disease and run the trials. And then we have regulators who are there to take care of us and make sure that we only approve things that can help and that don't hurt too much. And where would the patient be in all of this? So unlike every one of the other players that have the area where they are the experts, the patient community is in the field beginning to end, from when there was no research to when there are drugs approved. So we have a little bit that responsibility and privilege to be the ones that have the view of the entire field, that can identify where there are things that are missing and no one's taking care of. We can often address them, and it's not always funding. Sometimes there are other things that are needed, some tools, connecting people. Connecting people is key. Not only we bring the patient community, but also like research collaboration, research consortia, and clinical trial networks. And when there are companies, we need to sit them in the same room and make sure they're not fighting and they're helping each other and doing some pre-competitive work. Because one of the big things is to hold them all accountable, because each one has different incentives, and they come at different stages. But the ones that are here beginning to end is the patient community. So if I will have to distill down why the patients are needed, partnering in this process is to make sure that the vision and the direction stay set and keep them all accountable. And I hope in the next presentations here, you'll hear some examples of big and small and early in research and more advanced in research where the different patient groups or scientists partnering with patients have managed to do an impact. So Karina Thurgood, hi there. Come over because you have slides.
So good morning and welcome to you all. It's nice to see so many people here today. I'm Karina Thurgood, the CEO from the Maddi Foundation, and I'm board director of the Spastic Paraplegia Foundation in the US. I just want to say a big thank you to Cambridge Rare Disease Network and Joe for having me here today. So I'm here to talk about my mission to find a cure for my teenage daughter's ultra-rare disease and to explain our challenges, what we've faced along the way and what we're trying to achieve. Just a little bit of background of our story. In 2015, Maddi, my daughter, developed a slight limp when she was 14 years old. I took her to the GP thinking she had an unexplained injury. But to be honest, the GP wasn't sure what the problem was, so he referred her on to an orthopaedic doctor at a local hospital. Seeing Maddi, he wasn't at all concerned and was happy for us to go home and not worry. However, a few weeks later, I was back in his office, persisting something wasn't right. I asked him to refer Maddi to Great Ormond Street. I was sure there was something more going on. After further investigations with Great Ormond Street, we were given devastating news. It was thought that my daughter had a late onset of Dravet, a severe leukodystrophy disease. We were told she was the only teenager here in the UK. And after connecting with a Dravet expert in America, the treatment being offered at the time was a bone marrow transplant. Our family were very scared of what was lying ahead. Living with this knowledge for a few weeks, we then found out that the clinicians were misled, and further genetic testing showed Maddi was in fact a carrier of Dravet disease and had another disease called hereditary spastic paraplegia type 15, or SPG 15 for short. With this new diagnosis, again we were told Maddi was the only patient in the UK. The transplant was put on hold as it was not the correct treatment approach for SPG 15, which is a type of motor neuron disease. The disease symptoms for SPG 15 are devastating with no cure, and being ultra rare, there is not enough information about the condition. Life had been pretty normal to suddenly being thrown into continuous visits to the hospital for many tests, as the disease can cause spasticity in all the limbs, muscle weakness, bladder problems, visual impairments, Parkinson's, and many more issues. Suddenly our world turned upside down. I really think the shock of going through a bone marrow transplant was an option for her. So basically, to be told there was no treatment had pushed me into doing more to find a cure for SPG 15. Having the knowledge of how severe the symptoms could be, in desperation I took Maddi to see some experts in the field of hereditary spastic paraplegia by travelling to the US and Canada in hope of finding a solution and coming up with a plan. But no one could help us. However, on our travels, we kept hearing about gene therapy. So on our return, we reached out to Sheffield Institute of Translational Neuroscience at Sheffield University about a gene therapy approach for SPG 15. Although challenging, as the gene size is quite large, they said it could still be a possibility. This was exciting news for us. Someone was prepared to work on the disease. So our first hurdle was the funding. This was needed to get the research off the ground, but there was none available for such a rare disease. We had to work out a way ourselves to see what we could do, to plan some fundraising, to get this research started. So we reached out to our local communities who gave us a helping hand to organise some fundraisers, as you can see. And soon we reached the national TV news. We found out, who'd actually found out about our mission to find a cure. So they've been filming our story ever since, over the last couple of years. So in 2017, we became a registered charity, and we are the only foundation who exists and is dedicated to help with medical research into SPG 15. With enough funding from our community fundraisers, we partnered with Sheffield University to begin the work on research for gene therapy in 2017. The group at Sheffield are currently working on 3 different gene therapy approaches due to the size of the gene, as you can see. So here are our challenges. We've been given the options, and the Maddi Foundation have helped with the funding for the initial research to find a proof of concept for a gene therapy for SPG 15, but more funding is needed to go on to the next stage. But having a rare disease type does not give us enough support to give us to be able to fundraise in the UK. We are also finding it a slow process to locate patients, as they are all over the world, and sometimes there may only be one patient in a country, a little bit like Maddi. These patients may be registered with the doctors that do not understand the condition, and therefore it slips through the net that there may be a foundation out there searching for patients. We know we need to resolve this by educating these clinicians that there is some research going on that may benefit their patients in the future. When the disease is in the advanced stages, we do find families are less reluctant to become involved with research, and some even given up hope. So I keep travelling to meetings and conferences abroad to connect with other experts in the field of neurology who understand spastic paraplegia. A few months ago, a larger organisation called the Spastic Paraplegia Foundation in America contacted me to ask if I would like to join their board of directors, as they valued my knowledge and approach to research for SPG15. This is helping me to make more contacts. Given that there could be developments for therapeutic opportunities, it is important for us to engage a natural history study to be trial ready at some point. We are pleased to be given an opportunity from an amazing doctor at Boston Children's Hospital who has recently connected with me to consider taking on SPG15 and help work on building our registry for a natural history study. We are now looking for ways to find resources for such a study to begin. This is very promising and could potentially take us so much further, as he has already been working on a similar disease, so much of the groundwork has already been done. But this is going to be a huge challenge for us to raise that seed money as an investment. Finally, I just wanted to mention, this weekend I attended a conference in Nice, and a young scientist came up to me and said she's now starting to study SPG15. She told me she had a choice of other diseases to choose from, but she decided to choose ours, as she had recognised how proactive we had been and read about our story. This gave her encouragement to work on the disease, so it does give me great pleasure to inspire our young scientists and researchers to study rare diseases. So thank you to all our scientists and the collaborations that are being made across the world at the moment. Thank you.
Example of a very, very tiny disease where you have so few patients and like zero knowledge, we go to a very large rare disease, which is pretty much a celebrity of the rare diseases. So Dr. David Ball is the Chief Scientist Officer of Duchenne UK, and Duchenne is a celebrity.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm David Ball. I'm standing in for Emily, who's one of the co-founders of Duchenne UK. She and the other co-founder had an opportunity to speak to some people today, so she sends her apologies. I cannot speak with the same power that Emily would, or that you've just heard, but what I will try and do is to give you a flavour of the barriers that we've seen when we address Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and some of the things that we as a charity have done. Just briefly, Duchenne UK is a small charity, and as the name suggests, we're dedicated to fighting Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It affects in the region of 1 in 3,500 to 4,000 boys. It's an X-linked disease, and put that in context, it means that in this week coming, 2 families will get a diagnosis of Duchenne. It's a failure, it's a mutation in the largest gene in your body. And if you look at the Franklin, Crick and Watson model of DNA, it actually represents about 2.5 million base pairs. And there are 79 exons, so it's made of lots of chunks of proteins, and there are lots of places where the mutations occur. Duchenne UK is fairly well established now. We think we are the largest funder and supporter of research for Duchenne in the UK. And we've got, at the moment, we're committed to £10 million of funding. Now, if I get time, I will talk about research, but what I want to do is to focus on 2 areas. When, 6-7 years ago, when Emily's son was diagnosed with Duchenne, there was very little research was happening. there were no treatments, and in fact, there's still no cure. But what Emily found was that there were 3 main areas that were stopping action. The first was around actually getting pharma companies to talk together. We heard before that one of the issues is that pharma companies, are part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution too, and we can't ignore that. So I'm going to talk about that. I also want to talk about clinical trials and getting access, because it's one of the key problems that we come across now in the UK. So let's start with the pharma companies. As you know, when you submit data for a new drug, there's a lot of work that's involved. I originally worked for, it was GlaxoSmithKline, but I started when it was Alan Hamber's many years ago. At the time when Ariditidine, Zantac, was coming out. And if you went to a meeting, you did not talk about what work you were doing. You didn't give the data out. And it's still like that. Now, in a rare disease, we have several companies who are working in it. And of course, when they submit these health technology assessment documents, they have to have such things as life assessment. They need to have the costing. There's a lot of data, natural history, and it's not proprietary. So you have all of these trials going on with a limited population of boys, and we're wasting time duplicating data. So it doesn't seem to be an enormous logical jump to say, wouldn't it be great if we could get pharma companies to work together? And that's what Emily and Alex did. They formed something called Hercules. I always have to look this up, but it's health research collaboration leading to evidence synthesis. Now, we started with just a few. There are now 12 pharma companies who have agreed to be working together. And they include Pfizer, Roche, the smaller ones like Catabasis, Solid Biosciences in the US. And they have an aim to try to work together and agree to share the non-proprietary data. So the sort of things that they're looking at is a better way of assessing the cost of the disease in terms of a health survey and a quality of life assessment. That's not proprietary. It's the same whether you're Roche or whether you're Pfizer. So they're working on that together to produce a set of documentations, and they've got the statisticians from various universities supporting them, with the aim of bringing out natural history disease modulation, core economic model, and that whatever they're working on, this data is available to them all. And we've been driving that for quite a few years now. It's a great group, say 12 pharma companies, 3 universities are supporting this. And we're pushing forward. We're now into the phase 2, so we're into the latter stages where we're going to start pulling data together, with the aim of reducing the amount of work and the amount of time and the number of boys that have to go into duplicated studies, because that really is a terrible waste. The second area, clinical trials. So 6-7 years ago, when Emily's son was diagnosed, there were only 2 centres doing clinical trials for Duchenne. That was Great Ormond Street Hospital in London and the Newcastle University Trust Hospital obviously in Newcastle. And they were overwhelmed. They were turning, not only were they turning companies away who wanted to come and do a trial, but they were turning away boys who were willing, and the parents and the families who were willing to work with them to put their boys into trials. Again, this is not acceptable. And so Emily and Alex decided they were going to do something. This was a cost issue. It was a skills issue. It was a resources issue. And you can do something about those with the will and the finance. They set up something called the DMD Hub. You can look at this on the Duchenne UK website. The aim was to ensure, the goal was to ensure that every single boy in the UK who wanted to go on a clinical trial could do so. And so they created these hubs. It was driven out of Gaucher and Newcastle. They were providing the expertise, and what Emily and Alex did was, first of all, fund a position in Newcastle to manage this entire process. And they have ensured now we have a whole series of these hubs in hospitals where we fund nurses, we fund all of the clinical staff, we fund the resources, we fund the facilities, such that the pharmaceutical companies can come in and run their trials. Now, it's a staged economic model in that we fund the entire lot now, but we're tailing it off because obviously as the companies start to do the trials more and more, that will take over. We have at the moment Alderhay, Birmingham, Bristol, Glasgow, Leeds, London Evelina and Manchester. They're fully up and running. And then Cambridge and Oswald Street will be coming online soon. So, as I say, the aim is now that there will be never a boy in the UK who cannot get onto a trial. And as part of the hub site, if you go and have a look, you can actually find what clinical trials are going on at the moment. You can find who's recruiting, you can find out results, you can see what's coming down the line. So we've tried in those two areas to address the real blocks, because the speaker early on said, you can do amazing things if you put your mind to it. And it reminds me of the time, do you remember those adverts for AIDS? Now, within a very short time, the drive, the advertising, the money that came in made a huge difference. And that's what we've tried to do really with Duchenne UK by actually putting the facilities in and letting the drug companies do their bit. Am I okay for just like 2 minutes on research? Yeah, okay.
You're already 8 minutes.
Oh, I'm 8 minutes. Okay, then I won't do it. So I'll leave it there. I'll just finish to say, because I noticed one question was about orphan drug designation. Duchenne UK have been working on tamoxifen, a repurposed drug to shorten it down. We hold the orphan drug designation, and I'm going to mention the Brexit word because we can't hold this anymore because we're not in Europe. So we are now using our funders' money to set up an office in Dublin so that we can still do that. So I'll finish. I'm sorry, I've gone over. Okay.
So from a very large organization, but within the UK, now we go international to an even larger project by Tanya Collin-Histed, representing the International Gaucher Alliance.
So, good morning, everybody. As Anna said, my name is Tanya Collin-Histed, and I'm going to talk to you about the work of the International Gaucher Alliance. So, Gaucher's disease is a lysosomal storage disorder, I became involved in this world 23 years ago, actually, when my daughter Maddi, the one on my right, was diagnosed with neuronopathic Gaucher's disease. She was 17 months old, and the bottom literally fell out of my world. And there was no information, and I was told that she would die. Yesterday, she celebrated her 25th birthday. So, it goes to show that a lot has been done over the last few years. So, when Maddi was diagnosed, there was no information. I felt very alone. And like many parents or mothers, I became a single mum as well. The the impact of the diagnosis meant that my husband and I separated. So I wanted to know what to do, and I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a difference to Maddi, and I wanted to make a difference to our lives. So I became involved in the UK Association, which had been established since '91, so I'm not a founder. But everybody on that board had type 1 Gaucher's disease, which affects the visceral system, whereas Maddi's disease also affects the neurological system. For me, when Maddi's diagnosis, I had nobody to talk to. So for me, it was about emotional support. There was no information. So I wanted to bring together a community. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create a community. And I was really lucky because Maddi was actually diagnosed very, very quickly. And the reason she was diagnosed is that there was a centre at Great Ormond Street who a specialised service, and they recognised Gaucher's disease, and there was a treatment for the visceral aspects of the disease. So we were lucky. Our diagnostic journey was very, very quick. However, that was in 1996, and in 1999, I went to my first international meeting, and I suddenly realised that actually what I had experienced in the UK did not certainly happen anywhere else in the world, apart from probably some of the Western European countries and the US. And I realised how lucky I was. And I remembered how lonely I was. And I wanted other people didn't matter where they lived in the world, to know that somebody cared and that they could reach out and that there was somebody there to support them. So I became involved in what was then the European Gaucher Alliance, which is now the International Gaucher Alliance. And for me, my work has been about making sure that no patient is left behind. And this picture on here is a little girl called Naslim, who I recently supported her family in Kenya to access enzyme replacement therapy, which is a management treatment for Gaucher's disease. And it's a fortnightly infusion. However, it's very expensive. For one patient, it could cost up to £250,000 a year. And this little girl lives in a shack in Kenya. But we managed to basically get her treatment because a lot of the work that the International Gaucher Alliance does is, even though there are treatments, there are actually 5 for Gaucher's disease, for the visceral elements, that there are hundreds and hundreds of patients globally that cannot get this treatment because they are so expensive. So the International Gaucher Alliance work with companies for Pfizer, Takeda and Sanofi Genzyme who run charitable access programs who give donated treatment to these patients. And the reason that we do this is that we then empower those patients in those countries to set up their own patient organisations, to then go to their governments to ask for reimbursement and to educate their doctors. The other area that I want to talk about, obviously the session, is research and treatment development. So my personal story here is back in 2000, when Maddi was about 8 years old, there was the first ever clinical trial for neuronopathic Gaucher's disease. So she was already receiving enzyme replacement therapy, but it didn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So they started a trial with a drug called Zavesca. And unfortunately, it failed. It failed because it didn't meet its endpoints. Why didn't it meet its endpoints? Because the company who developed it chose the wrong endpoints, and because they didn't understand the disease. They didn't understand how it affected these children and in their everyday lives. So what were we going to do about it? So there's my colleague in the audience, Ellen Haff-Davis, who will be talking later. She was a clinical trial nurse on the Zavesca trial, and she's dedicated a lot of her professional career to making a difference to patients by looking at the ways in you can use wearable technology. So that's what we did. We wanted to look at how could we really understand how this disease affected children and young people in their everyday lives. What were their symptoms and what was the impact? So that we could truly understand if we were to find, if there was to be a drug, what would it have to, what would we want it to address? How would we prove to the regulators that it worked in order to get it accessible to patients? So we did this wearable tech project. We actually designed it with the patients. So we asked them how the disease affected them, what the impacts were. They had a watch, they had a phone app, and they recorded it. And actually, I'm really proud to say that we've just had a paper published on this, which is available. So in neuronopathic Gaucher's disease, the trial that we had was in the early 2000s. And because it didn't meet its endpoints, I truly believe that a lot of companies have been very cautious about going back into that area. And it is an ultra-orphan disease. So Gaucher's disease is a rare disease, but type 2 and 3, which affect the neurological aspects of the patient, basically are very, very rare. So you have a very small base of patients. But there is now a lot of interest, probably about 7 companies, and a lot of this is on the back of the link now discovered between Parkinson's and Gaucher's disease. So we as an international community said, well, what can we do about this? How can we drive through this research? So we believe that we can do this through developing a global patient-led registry. So that's actually what we're doing. We've done phase 1 of the registry, and this is working with industry, key opinion leaders and the patients, and they have designed what will be in the registry. What is it that the clinicians want to collect? What is important to industry? And what is it that the patients want to see? And just going back to the previous slide, it's not only about collecting data, but we want to look at using it to validate new outcomes and patient-reported measures. And what we're trying to do as an IGA is that now we've placed ourselves as the go-to organisation internationally. So myself and my colleagues from the IGA, we are now sitting on advisory boards for all of these companies. And what we want to try and do is make sure that they're all using the same measures. And we want to make sure that they're identifying the right patients for the right treatment. And we know as a community where those patients are. So this is something that we're working for at the moment. However, it all sounds very positive, but there are a lot of challenges. The IGA, although an international organisation, there's only myself as the CEO and some admin staff, my team, and it's very challenging, a big resource. So it's about working with stakeholders, identifying who else can support you on that journey. Thank you.
So while the first three panelists gave us ideas of what they've been doing within each disease, the last two will speak a little bit more about the concept of working across diseases to solve those common problems. And first will be Allison Watson from ring chromosome 20, which is another ultra rare, but again, she's working more on common problems.
Hi, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today and tell you a little bit about ring chromosome 20 syndrome. My shout out for the really ultra rare diseases, and my shout out today is share if you're ultra rare. Okay, tell you a little bit about myself and how I fit into things. I am co-founder for the Ring 20 Research and Support UK patient support group. We are the only patient support group in the world for ring chromosome 20 syndrome, or R20 for short. We've been established for about 5 years. We are a coffee table patient support group, recently established a medical advisory board, which is incredibly useful, and we're supporting about 100 families worldwide. What we do is we signpost our families to information about the condition, about the disease, and we try to connect them so that they can share mutual support. And we're currently in the process of raising funds for research. So, a little bit about ring chromosome 20 syndrome. What is R20? Well, it's a very difficult to treat epilepsy. It doesn't respond to treatment. It's associated with learning and behaviour difficulties. Fact. Ring chromosomes occur in about 1 in 50,000 births. So why only are there 150 cases of ring chromosome 20 syndrome cited in medical literature worldwide? Leads us to suggest that ring chromosome 20 syndrome is underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And why are there the challenges here? Well, the normal epilepsy gene panel testing consists of exomes or whole genome sequencing, chromosomal microarray. None of those new genetic testing techniques will pick up ring chromosome 20 syndrome, particularly in the mosaic form. Particularly pertinent, we're here today at the Wellcome Genome Campus, where the hub of the whole genome sequencing, and you have a rare disease that you can't diagnose yet. Why is the challenge, or how do you diagnose ring chromosome 20 syndrome? Well, you have to go back a step. You have to look at a carrier type. You have to request a test for chromosomal mosaicism, because it exists in a mosaic and non-mosaic form. And you have to look for a significant number of cells to be able to pick up the ring chromosome. So anybody with any great ideas to moving forward from that, I'd love to talk to you today. So, we come from a position where there's no recommended treatment for our rare disease at this particular point in time. You'll probably have heard the term many of our patients are treated on a trial and error basis. We just throw another treatment, another drug at them, add on another one and another one, see if it works. Usually doesn't. There are no clinical practice guidelines for this disease. The clinicians are working blind when they're treating these patients. There is no patient registry. There's no way of knowing where these patients exist or how many there are in the UK, in Europe or the world. Very limited research available, very, very limited number of cases written about in medical literature, and we've never had a clinical trial. So we're really at the start of that pathway for the drug discovery process. But turn that on its head and start to look, how do we turn a negative into a positive? There's got to be another way. The only way is up for us. How do we achieve this? Well, we've become a team player. So a couple of years ago, I was asked to join EpiCARE, the European reference network for rare and complex epilepsies. Many of you will have heard about ERNs, European Reference Networks, and I was asked to become part of the patient advisory group, which I now co-chair. How has this helped? Well, merely by being part of that patient advisory group, the profile of Ring20 has been raised enormously in context to where we sit amongst the 130 rare epilepsies that are represented by EpiCARE. The awareness of Ring20 amongst the neurologists, the epileptologists, the researchers that I'm talking to on a regular basis is being heightened all the time across Europe. We're working to improve information. We're now working on creating leaflets for healthcare professionals and for patients to bridge that gap on information about the disease. We're looking to increase education by creating webinars about Ring20 and many of the other rare diseases, but Ring20 will be one of the first. We're also working to look at opportunities for research. So off of the back of some work that we were doing with Patient-Led Research Hub here in Cambridge over the last year, where we undertook a survey to study the effectiveness of ketogenic dietary therapy in Ring20, which established a paper which we are just about to publish as our first ever manuscript on for us as a patient support group. We're now looking at potential opportunities for research within the ERN of EpiCARE to look at a potential observational study of Ring20 in ketogenic dietary therapy across the European cohort. As part of ERNs, registries are being created, and I'm part of the registry working group. And hopefully by establishing a registry of rare epilepsies, which includes ring chromosome 20, we address that gap of understanding where the patients exist and how many there actually really are. And hopefully those numbers will increase. And we're working very much to increase awareness to reduce that diagnostic odyssey. I have my poster outside today, come and talk to us. We've created an opportunity for you guys to talk to us about helping us to solve the puzzle of the diagnostic journey or the diagnosis for Ring20 and how we can improve that and better understand the prevalence of this rare disease. There have been a few challenges in working as part of an ERN as a patient advocate. And one of the key challenges is around culture. It's a cultural change to work as patients alongside healthcare professionals. It's not necessarily a very natural relationship. It's something that we have to work on from both sides. And it's something new that we have to build together. Clinicians are not used to talking to us as equals, and they're not used to understanding that what we have to bring to the table. Yes, we have lived experience of living every day with our rare disease. My son David is 22 years old, he's diagnosed with ring 20 at 6 years of age, so I've been living with this for many, many years. And you become an expert patient in not only the care of your child, but an expert in the disease. You read every bit of information that you can, you attend conferences and events. You actually, on the ultra rare diseases, know more than many of the healthcare professionals that are treating your child because they don't have that level of knowledge. And we have so much more to bring to the table from our own professional skills in our day-to-day work. I have skills in project management, others have skills in marketing and social media that can benefit and come together and partner with the physicians and their medical knowledge and expertise. And when we bring those two things together, we actually result in true collaboration. So, how are we aiming to overcome? Well, we'll continue to raise the patient voice, continue to shout out about our rare diseases. We're continually learning. This is a big journey, and we want to work together. Thank you very much.
So from Allison showing us some of the common problems that you're addressing through the year-ends, we go to our last panelist, Dr. Paul Wicks, from Wicks International Health. And he's going to give us some more ideas of how to address those problems that are common to so many rare diseases.
So I worked for about 13 years at a company called Patients Like Me, which was one of the world's largest sort of social networks for patients living with chronic conditions. It was founded by a family affected by ALS, or motor neuron disease. That's what my scientific training is in. I've been studying the disease for 17 years, and then ironically, 4 years ago, I became a caregiver. So like many of you, I've sat on both sides of many of these discussions. One of the experiences I wanted to share with this group is how we went from one disease to actually 3,300 conditions by the time patients like me sort of went through a little bit of a turbulent time recently due to the Trump administration. So we're about an hour in before we mentioned Brexit. Someone needs to mention Trump at some point, so I guess that's me. And the way we did that originally was actually looking at adjacent areas in terms of the functionality that crossed that. So we started in motor neuron disease because that's where the family's experience was. They'd funded a non-profit for 10 years in that area, and so we're very interested to build out not just how do we find a cure for our family member affected, but actually how do we help them live day to day. And I think that's actually where one of the great opportunities of digital health is, not necessarily just to accelerate trials and create outcome registries and select the right PROs and things like that, use wearables, that's all excellent. But also to say, well, how should I live with seizures? How should I live with cramps? How should I have a conversation with my doctor as an equal? What's the terminology I should use? What should I do when I run into resistance? And actually, if you were to map out the sort of area under the curve of suffering for all of our 7,000 multiplied by everybody, I actually think there's probably, in the short and medium term, more gain to be made in the sharing of solutions and the bringing together of groups that we can actually get some positive outcomes on sooner. That also, as we do it, sets the stage for some of the longer term things. So really, this is a combination of two areas, right? So it's data and basically power. And I think sometimes by over-obsessing on data, we actually lose sight of where the fulcra of power really live. So with data, the things that really were the game changers for us were to try and take a step back from individual disease verticals and say, across phenotype, what is the issue here? So if you've got weakness in your legs, or you have Parkinsonism affecting your gait, or you have balance issues in MS, we're all talking about mobility. We're all talking about getting around. And yet there are very few places where you can go to sort of say, well, what's the right electric wheelchair solution? Or what is the right mobility solution? Or to actually join those up and to say, well, it's the combination of house modifications and a wheelchair accessible vehicle and going to the right places. That holistic solution that's actually going to be the game changer. That will then fit into, say, actually to the trial centres that we're going to, are these compatible with these systems that people are using? So I think there's a lot of unmet need there. And that really comes from mapping out the phenotype, right? So we've talked a lot about the human genome sort of mapping. There's not that corresponding thing for phenome. There's not that corresponding ontological link to the same extent to say, this is function, this is movement, this is social relationships. We have quite a lot of sort of slightly outdated and fuzzy stuff around quality of life. But I think the time has come to turn that into a real science, so that when we're improving outcomes across multiple diseases, we can then reconcile those into a value framework that helps us to say, is this worth paying for? In many cases, perhaps a more powered wheelchair with greater functionality and greater compatibility might be better than a drug that slows disease progression for a certain amount of time, but we're not having those conversations. The other lesson learned for us was about power. So once you've got a large data source, once you seem to be representing a large number of people, the opportunity then comes to open up doors for others. So for us, I think probably the most useful things were around the patients included movement at conferences. So when we were going to medical conferences and finding that lots of people were talking about patients without them being there, we wanted to sort of echo the frustration that many people felt to say, well, here are some guidelines, and actually here's, instead of a stick to beat you with, here's a positive aspiration that you can move towards to say, if you have patients involved in the planning committee, you have patients involved, you know, actually making decisions and having power, not just sort of telling their story to make the audience feel good that they're, you know, earning their halos. And to say that to the extent possible we'll support patients and caregivers to travel there and that we'll live stream the meeting, that this is a positive step. And I think our sort of involvement there was, you know, hoping that 1 or 2 people might take it up. And I think in 2018, about 50 conferences signed up to this. Mm-hmm. And the idea is not that we're just going to have the sort of patient expert empowerment people that we know from Twitter, but that actually we're training or opening the doors for hundreds and then thousands of people to step through the doors. And that's, you know, next generations coming through with a whole different set of perspectives than we necessarily have with our experiences. The other thing that triggered was follow-ons in other areas of power. So I think the one that's been most interesting for us is peer-reviewed journals. So the British Medical Journal, you know, part of the BMA, so quite a fusty, you know, old white guy institution, was not necessarily used to listening to patients and putting the patient voice first. And yet they saw there was a huge gap in actually getting to where they wanted to achieve. So they wanted to be the world's most influential medical journal. And they realized that by not including patients, they're actually missing a significant trick there. So now, if you prepare a paper to go off to the, you know, number 3 medical journal in the world about one of these diseases, it's going to get reviewed by a person with lived experience of that disease. And when you tell companies that, they go, aha, that's going to be rather embarrassing when we have to fill out the box that says, how did you involve patients in the design of this study? How do you plan to feedback the results? Because if you say, we're not, actually the BMJ will publish that, and you have to have this awful little box saying, we didn't listen to patients, we didn't involve them in this, and you know, we have no plans to disseminate them back. And just having that sort of badge initially to say, well, wouldn't it be better if we said, we asked patients what the important outcomes were, and we involved them to reduce the burden of the trial, and of course we're going to publish this open access, and of course we're going to, you know, communicate it back to them. It's an opportunity to do good. So, you know, I think the lessons learned for us have been try and see the cross-cutting things, try and step beyond the disease. It's probably clumps and clusters of groups that can work together most efficiently. You know, so we see seizures across thousands of diseases, for example. Yet when we initially went into epilepsy, we just thought of it as one particular vertical, and I think we would have done much better to talk about modules that cut across those systems. So I think there's a great opportunity. I don't think there's going to be a single Facebook type thing to rule them all. I think it's going to be, you know, a number of approaches that all have to share common standards, and it'll be great to see how everybody interacts in that space. Thanks.
So since we're running late, I did want to wrap up with one quick question to each of you, if you can get it down to one line. What's the one thing that we could change or do that will have the biggest impact on getting therapies forward for rare diseases? The one thing.
Most of the solutions we're talking about are not plugged into the clinical and health data ecosystem. We're mostly on the outside looking in. We need the NHS digital and whatever to be serving that data out, because actually that's how people get paid, that's how guidelines get changed, that's where drug companies go to see where things are going on. So it's actually us now saying, instead of we had to make our own solution, we had to make our own registry, going to the places where the data are and basically say, actually that's our damn data, give it to us and let us use it in ways that we need to. Mm-hmm. That's going to be the game changer.
For me, I would say it's think about the ultra-rare diseases differently. There's a big difference between a rare disease with 10,000 patients in every country, so 10,000 patients in the UK, and an ultra-rare disease that has 5, 10 patients in the UK. Needs a very different solution, very different approach, and I think that needs to be considered and not forgotten.
Mm-hmm. I think my message would be that we need to work more as a community. Yeah. Particularly when you have a large number of companies involved in one drug. that actually we're all there for the patient. And I think thinking about the Hercules project and the work that we're doing in the International Gaucher Alliance, you can bring communities together.
I think I would echo what we've already heard, and that is that the companies who are bringing these expensive medicines to market have got to share everything they can. Yeah. And we've got to break open the registries where our patient data is being stored and sometimes held onto, perhaps inappropriately. So it's about communication and collaboration.
Karina.
I mean, for us, we really do need more collaboration because our disease is very rare, considering my daughter's the only one in the UK. So it's trying to have a little bit more help with, we're trying to build a patient registry, and if we had more help, say, in the UK, for a situation like ours, to sort of reach out to other communities, obviously, but we have to work globally. So to try and get everyone on board to help work with us would be ideal.
So get data out of where it's hidden, get companies to partner and collaborate, and do some help for the very ultra rare, because it's very hard to lift everything from scratch. Well, thank you so much.